The Zakran Empire had existed for 3,000 years, and in that time they had conquered 47 different species across 200 star systems. Their method was always the same, and it had never failed them once. They would arrive with an overwhelming military force, deliver their ultimatum to the species they intended to subjugate, and then wait exactly 72 hours for the inevitable surrender. Every single species had submitted. Some took the full 3 days to decide, while others gave up within hours, but they all eventually knelt before the Zakran Empire. The alternative was complete extinction, and no species had ever been foolish enough to choose death over servitude. Admiral Gregory Hunt stood on the command bridge of the UNS Defiance, which was Earth's largest and most advanced warship. He watched through the massive viewport as 300 alien vessels materialized at the edge of humanity's solar system. The ships appeared in perfect formation, each one significantly larger than any spacecraft humanity had ever constructed. This was the Ninth Fleet, the most decorated and feared military force in the entire Zakran Empire. They had crushed rebellions, destroyed resistance movements, and broken the spirits of countless civilizations. Now they had come for Earth. The message arrived simultaneously on every communication device across Earth and all of her colonies. Computers, phones, holographic displays, and even old radio systems all received the same transmission at the exact same moment. The face that appeared on every screen belonged to Ambassador Vrelnak, the chief diplomatic officer of the Zakran Empire. He had 4 golden eyes that seemed to gleam with absolute confidence, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. He spoke, and the alien technology automatically translated his words into every human language. The ambassador's message was clear and direct. Humanity had 72 hours to completely surrender. They would dismantle every military ship, every weapon, every defense system. They would hand over 30% of their entire population to serve as laborers in Zakran mining colonies and construction projects. They would surrender all of their faster-than-light travel technology and allow Zakran overseers to govern Earth and her colonies. In exchange for this total submission, humanity would be allowed to survive. The ambassador made it very clear that this was not a negotiation or a discussion. This was the only offer humanity would receive. Compliance meant survival, while resistance meant every man, woman, and child would be exterminated. The transmission ended, and the 300 warships of the Ninth Fleet settled into a waiting position. Deep beneath the city of Geneva in Switzerland, President Claire Morrison sat in the war room with her cabinet and military advisors. The room was filled with tension as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Defense Secretary Frank Hayes stood at the head of the table with a holographic display showing the tactical situation. The numbers were devastating. Earth's combined military fleet consisted of 87 warships. The Zakran had brought 300. Every computer simulation that had been run in the last hour showed the same result. If humanity chose to fight, they would be completely defeated within 18 hours of the first shot being fired. The technology gap between the two civilizations was significant, and the numbers were overwhelmingly against Earth. President Morrison looked around the table at the faces of her advisors. Some looked angry while others looked resigned. A few looked terrified. She spoke quietly, but her voice carried authority. They were being given 3 days to choose between becoming slaves or being wiped out of existence. It seemed like an impossible choice. There was no third option, no clever diplomatic solution, no hidden advantage that Earth possessed. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched in every measurable way. Colonel Lisa Martinez, who headed the Special Weapons Development Program, raised her hand hesitantly. She was younger than most of the people in the room, and her area of expertise was considered theoretical by many of her colleagues. She cleared her throat and spoke carefully. There might be a third option, but it had never been tested at the scale that would be required. Every eye in the room turned to her. President Morrison leaned forward and asked her to explain. Martinez pulled up technical schematics on the holographic display and began outlining a plan that seemed absolutely insane. The more she talked, the quieter the room became. When she finished, nobody spoke for almost a minute. Frank Hayes was the first to break the silence. He stated flatly that what Martinez was proposing would result in massive casualties. Martinez nodded and confirmed that yes, thousands of people would die. Probably more. But the alternative was billions of people spending the rest of their lives in chains. President Morrison asked how long they would need to implement this plan. Martinez calculated quickly and said they would need at least 60 hours of uninterrupted preparation time. That left them 12 hours before the ultimatum deadline expired. The margins were razor thin. Morrison looked around the table one more time, and then made her decision. She authorized the plan and ordered it to begin immediately. Admiral Hunt received his orders 18 hours after the Zakrin ultimatum had been delivered. He read them 3 times because he could not quite believe what he was being asked to do. The orders were simple, direct, and completely insane by every conventional standard of military strategy. But as he read them a 4th time, he began to understand the logic behind the madness. Earth could not win a conventional battle. Their only chance was to do something so unexpected and so extreme that the Zakrin would never see it coming. Hunt immediately transmitted the orders to every ship captain in the fleet. Across human space, from Earth to the Mars colonies to the outer mining stations, every single military vessel received the same instructions. Engineers began working around the clock. Safety protocols were suspended. Normal operating procedures were thrown out completely. What they were about to do violated every rule in the book, but the book had been written for conventional warfare. This was going to be something entirely different. The Zakrin fleet waited patiently at the edge of the solar system. They had seen desperate species before. They had witnessed last-minute scrambling and panicked preparations. It never mattered. The outcome was always the same. In 72 hours, humanity would surrender just like everyone else had. The commander of the 9th Fleet was so confident that he had already begun preparing the occupation schedules and labor conscription lists. It never occurred to him that humanity might choose a different path entirely. The Zakrin waited with growing contempt as the hours ticked by. 60 hours had passed since they delivered their ultimatum, and humanity had sent no response. There had been no communication attempts, no desperate pleas for mercy, and no offers of negotiation. The silence was unusual but not particularly concerning. Some species took longer to accept their fate than others. Commander Thelvas, who was second in command of the 9th Fleet, monitored the human military vessels through long-range sensors. What he observed was puzzling and somewhat disappointing. Instead of preparing defensive positions around Earth or attempting to evacuate their colonies, the humans had done something completely unexpected. Every single one of their 87 warships had moved into a tight formation near their moon. They were clustering together in a relatively small area of space. Thelvas remarked to his subordinates that the humans were grouping themselves for easier destruction. They were making the Zakrin's task simpler. Perhaps they had already given up and were preparing to surrender their fleet without a fight. It would save time and ammunition. What the Zakrin sensors could not detect were the modifications happening inside those human ships. For 60 hours straight, human engineers had worked without sleep. Some of them had taken stimulants to stay awake, while others simply pushed through exhaustion with pure determination. On every ship, teams of engineers were performing the same dangerous modifications. They were recalibrating fusion reactors, rewiring containment fields, and systematically disabling every safety system that had been built into the ships. Lieutenant Commander Peter Blake was overseeing the modifications on the Defiance. His hand shook slightly as he bypassed the final failsafe on the ship's main fusion reactor. What they were doing violated every principle of reactor safety that had been taught in engineering schools. Fusion reactors were designed with multiple redundant safety systems to prevent exactly what they were now attempting to cause. The fusion cores were meant to operate within very specific parameters. The magnetic containment bottles that held the superheated plasma could only withstand certain levels of stress. What they were doing now pushed far beyond any safe operational limits. Blake checked his instruments and reported to Admiral Hunt that the reactors were entering critical range. They had pushed the output to 400% of normal levels, and the numbers were still climbing. The temperature inside the reactor chamber was rising steadily, and the magnetic containment fields were beginning to show strain. Hunt listened to the report and then calmly ordered Blake to keep going. They needed to reach 800% output. Blake hesitated for a moment and then voiced his concerns. At 800%, the containment would fail. The ship would experience a catastrophic reactor breach. Hunt acknowledged that he understood exactly what would happen. That was the entire point of what they were doing. Blake asked how long they could maintain 800% output before everything failed. He consulted his calculations and estimated maybe 90 seconds before cascading failure destroyed the ship. Hunt nodded and said that 90 seconds would be enough. Across the human fleet, similar conversations were happening on 86 other ships. Captains were giving orders that would doom their vessels. Engineers were pushing reactors far beyond safe limits. Crew members were accepting that they might not survive the next few hours. But nobody refused their orders. Nobody abandoned their posts. They all understood what was at stake. This was not just about winning a battle. This was about sending a message to the entire galaxy. Humanity would not submit. They would rather die fighting than live as slaves. At 71 hours and 30 minutes after the original ultimatum, President Morrison sent humanity's official response to the Zakran Empire. The message was only 3 words long, but those 3 words contained everything the Zakran needed to know about humanity's decision. The message simply said, "Come and take it." There was no explanation, no justification, and no elaboration. Just 3 words of absolute defiance. The Ninth Fleet received the message and began their approach toward Earth. They accelerated in a standard conquest formation that had been used successfully hundreds of times before. 300 warships moving in perfect synchronization with their weapons charging and their troop transports ready to deploy. This had become routine for them. They had done this so many times that the commanders were already thinking about what they would do during their shore leave after the conquest was complete. "Commander," Thelvis noticed that the human fleet was beginning to move. The 87 ships were breaking formation and accelerating directly toward the approaching Zakran armada. Thelvis noted that the humans were advancing to meet them. He commented that it was brave but ultimately foolish. The human ships were not spreading out to create tactical advantages. They were not attempting evasive maneuvers or using any sophisticated strategy. They were just burning their engines at maximum power on a direct intercept course. It looked like they were planning some kind of desperate ramming attack. Such tactics were the mark of a species that had already accepted defeat, but wanted to go down fighting. Ambassador Vrelnak observed the human fleet from his position on the Zakran flagship. He found their behavior curious. They were sacrificing all strategic positioning and throwing away any tactical advantages they might have possessed. He wondered aloud what they thought they were accomplishing. Perhaps they believed that closing the distance quickly would somehow give them a better chance. It was a naive strategy that would only result in their faster destruction. On the bridge of the Defiance, every alarm system was shrieking at maximum volume. The fusion reactor had reached 700% output, and the numbers were still climbing. The hull of the ship groaned and creaked under the enormous stress. Metal surfaces that had been cool to the touch were now hot enough to burn exposed skin. The lights flickered intermittently as power distribution systems struggled to handle the massive energy flows. The temperature on the bridge had risen 15 degrees above normal, and crew members were sweating, despite the life support systems running at full capacity. Blake announced that all ships were reporting reactor critical status. They had achieved 800% output across the entire fleet. The magnetic containment fields were failing on multiple vessels. Some ships had already lost containment on secondary systems. They were running out of time. Hunt opened a communication channel to every human ship. His voice was calm and steady as he addressed his fellow officers. He told them it had been an honor to serve with them. He reminded them to remember what they were fighting for and who they were protecting. Humanity did not kneel. Not today and not ever. 87 ship captains responded with brief acknowledgments. There were no long speeches or dramatic declarations. Just quiet acceptance of what was about to happen. Hunt gave his final order. All ships were to engage full throttle and get into the heart of the Zakran formation. The human fleet surged forward at maximum acceleration, rushing to meet their fate and to deliver humanity's answer with fire. The human fleet crossed the distance between themselves and the Zakran armada in 8 minutes of hard acceleration. The Zakran opened fire when the human ships came within maximum weapons range. Their energy cannons and missile systems were incredibly accurate and devastating in their destructive power. The first volley destroyed 12 human ships instantly. They simply ceased to exist, vaporized by weapons that were far more advanced than anything humanity had developed. 18 more ships were destroyed in the second volley. The wreckage tumbled through space, leaving trails of debris and frozen atmosphere. The remaining human vessels did not return fire. They did not deploy countermeasures or activate defensive shields. They just kept coming, pushing their engines beyond safe limits, racing toward the enemy fleet with single-minded determination. Commander Thelvas watched the human ships approaching and felt a mixture of contempt and confusion. They were attempting ramming attacks, which was the most desperate and primitive tactic imaginable. It was something that civilizations tried when they had absolutely no other options left. It rarely worked because ships could be destroyed long before they reached their targets. The humans were throwing away their lives for nothing. Another wave of Zakran fire destroyed more human vessels. The kill ratio was completely one-sided. For every minute that passed, several more human ships were eliminated. By the time the human fleet reached the Zakran formation, their numbers had been cut nearly in half. Only 43 ships had survived the gauntlet of enemy fire. But those 43 ships had accomplished their objective. They had penetrated deep into the heart of the Zakran formation. The human vessels were now scattered throughout the enemy fleet, with Zakran warships surrounding them on all sides. The humans had not been trying to ram specific targets. They had simply been trying to get as close as possible to as many enemy vessels as they could reach. Now they were exactly where they needed to be. Admiral Hunt looked at his tactical display one final time. 43 ships had made it through. It would have to be enough. The plan had called for at least 40 ships to reach the Zakran formation. They had exceeded that minimum requirement by 3 vessels. All around the Defiant, Zakran warships loomed like metal mountains. Some were so close that Hunt could see the details of their hull plating through the viewport. The enemy ships were preparing to fire again at point-blank range. This would be the killing blow that would eliminate the last remnants of Earth's fleet. But the Zakran were about to learn that humanity had not come here to ram their ships. Hunt turned to Lieutenant Commander Blake and spoke quietly. It was time to release containment. Blake's hand hovered over the control panel. The button he was about to press would doom everyone on the ship. There would be no escape pods, no last-minute rescues, and no survivors. He whispered a brief prayer asking for forgiveness and then pressed the button. The magnetic containment fields that had been holding the overcharged fusion reactor in check collapsed instantly. 800% overcharged fusion plasma that had been compressed and superheated beyond all safety limits was suddenly free. For a fraction of a second, the reactor attempted to expand into the space available. Then physics took over, and the Defiant ceased to exist as a ship. It became something else entirely. It became a temporary star. 43 human ships detonated simultaneously across the Zakran formation. 43 fusion reactors that had been deliberately pushed to the breaking point all failed at exactly the same moment. Each reactor released energy equivalent to multiple strategic nuclear weapons. But unlike bombs, which released their energy in a single instantaneous burst, these reactor breaches were sustained. The fusion chain reaction continued for nearly 3 full seconds before the fuel was exhausted. Those 3 seconds were an eternity in terms of energy release. The temperature at the epicenter of each detonation exceeded 50 million degrees. That was hotter than the core of most stars. The Zakran ships that were in the immediate vicinity simply vaporized. Their hulls, their shields, their weapons, their crews, all of it was converted to superheated plasma in microseconds. There was no time to react, no time to activate emergency systems, and no time to even understand what was happening. One moment the ships existed, and the next moment they were gone, transformed into expanding clouds of ionized gas. The shockwave from the detonations expanded outward at a significant fraction of light speed. Zakran warships that were not close enough to be vaporized were caught in the blast wave. The force was unimaginable. Ships that had been designed to withstand the rigors of interstellar travel and the impacts of conventional weapons were crushed like tin cans. Their armor plating, which could deflect energy beams and kinetic projectiles, might as well have been tissue paper against this kind of force. Ships tumbled end over end, their structural integrity compromised, their hulls breached in dozens of places. Entire sections were torn away and sent spinning into the void. The electromagnetic pulse that accompanied the detonations knocked out electronic systems across the entire Zakran formation. Ships went dark as their computers crashed. Navigation systems failed. Weapons targeting became impossible. Life support systems stopped functioning. Communication arrays went offline. The Zakran fleet was suddenly blind, deaf, and crippled. They were floating helplessly in space, surrounded by the aftermath of the most devastating attack they had ever experienced. Then came the radiation. Gamma rays, X-rays, and neutron bombardment flooded outward from the detonation points. The Zakran shields had been designed to stop energy weapons and kinetic projectiles. They had been tested against every conventional weapon that the Zakran military scientists could imagine, but they had never been designed to stop the radiation output of multiple stellar cores. The shields were overwhelmed instantly. Lethal doses of radiation penetrated the hulls of ships that were dozens of kilometers away from the detonation points. Zakran crew members who had survived the initial blast and the shockwave now found themselves dying from radiation poisoning. Some died within minutes, while others would linger for hours in agony before their bodies finally gave up. Commander Thelvis had approximately 3 seconds to understand what was happening before his ship's bridge was breached by the shockwave from the nearest detonation. In those 3 seconds, his mind raced through the implications of what he was witnessing. The humans had not been attempting ramming attacks. They had been delivering bombs. They had turned their own ships into weapons of mass destruction. They had sacrificed themselves deliberately and willingly. His last thought before the bulkhead collapsed and crushed him was that he had completely underestimated these creatures. Perhaps humanity understood warfare better than the Zakran had ever realized. Perhaps their willingness to die made them more dangerous than any species the Zakran had previously encountered. Then he died, and there was no more time for thoughts. The remaining human fleet, which had been carefully positioned outside the blast radius, waited and watched. They had sacrificed 43 ships and 17,000 crew members. Now it was time to honor that sacrifice by finishing what their comrades had started. Captain Roy Sullivan commanded the UNS Vengeance, which was now the largest surviving ship in the human fleet. As the blinding light from the detonations began to fade, his sensors started picking up what remained of the mighty Ninth Fleet. The readings that appeared on his screens were almost impossible to believe, but the computers confirmed them multiple times. The greatest military force in the Zakran Empire had been shattered. Captain Sullivan stared at his tactical display and asked his sensor operator to confirm the readings again. The young officer ran the scan 3 more times, and each time the results were the same. Of the 300 Zakran warships that had entered the solar system with such confidence, only 40 ships remained intact. The word intact was being generous, because most of those 40 ships were showing critical damage across multiple systems: hull breaches, reactor failures, life support compromised, weapons offline, and navigation systems destroyed. The sensor officer estimated that fewer than 15% of the surviving ships were actually combat capable. The rest were just floating debris waiting to be finished off. The Ninth Fleet had been annihilated. The pride of the Zakran Empire, the military force that had conquered 47 civilizations, had been reduced to burning wreckage and radioactive debris in less than 10 minutes. Sullivan opened a communication channel to all remaining human vessels. There were 44 ships left in the human fleet, battered and damaged but still operational. His orders were simple and direct. They would commence the attack immediately, and they would show no mercy. The Zakran had come here offering humanity a choice between slavery and death. Now humanity was going to show them what death looked like. The human ships spread out and began hunting down the survivors. It was less a battle than an execution. The Zakran vessels that still had functioning weapons tried to fight back, but their efforts were uncoordinated and largely ineffective. Their targeting systems were damaged, their crews were dying from radiation exposure, and their command structure had been completely destroyed. The flagship that had carried Ambassador Vrelnak was nothing but scattered atoms now. Most of the senior commanders were dead. The ships that remained were operating independently without any central coordination. Some Zakran captains attempted to surrender. They broadcast messages in multiple languages, begging for mercy and offering to provide intelligence about the Zakran Empire in exchange for their lives. The human fleet ignored these pleas and continued firing. Other Zakran ships attempted to flee, trying to activate their faster-than-light drives to escape the system. The human ships pursued them and destroyed them before they could jump away. There would be no survivors. There would be no one left to return home and report what had happened here. That was intentional. Humanity wanted to control the narrative of this battle. They would be the ones to tell the story. The UNS Vengeance caught up with a crippled Zakran cruiser that was trying to limp away from the battle zone. The alien ship's engines were failing and it was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. Sullivan ordered his weapons officer to target the reactor. A single missile strike finished the job. The cruiser exploded in a brief flash of light. And then there was just more debris floating in space. Sullivan felt no satisfaction from the kill. This was not about revenge or glory. This was about survival. This was about making absolutely certain that the galaxy understood humanity was not prey. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted 6 more hours. Human ships methodically tracked down every surviving Zakran vessel. Some of the enemy ships had drifted far from the main battle zone and were trying to hide among the asteroids or behind moons. The human fleet found them all. When the last Zakran ship was destroyed, the human vessels regrouped near Earth. They had taken casualties during the initial charge into the enemy formation. They had lost 43 ships to the detonations. But they had won. Against impossible odds, using a tactic that no one had ever tried before, humanity had defeated a force 3 times their size and far more advanced. Captain Sullivan sat in his command chair and felt exhaustion wash over him. He had been awake for almost 70 hours straight. His hands were shaking from a combination of stimulants, adrenaline crash, and the weight of what they had just done. Around him, his crew was quietly celebrating, but the mood was subdued. They had won, but the cost had been devastating. 17,000 people had died in the detonations. Good people. Brave people. People with families and friends and futures that would never happen now. Those deaths weighed heavily on everyone who had survived. Sullivan received a direct communication from Earth. President Morrison appeared on his screen, looking exhausted and older than she had looked 3 days ago. She congratulated him on the victory and thanked him for his service. Then she gave him one more task. She wanted him to send a message to the Zakran homeworld, not a diplomatic message or a peace offering. A warning. Sullivan understood immediately what she wanted, and he agreed completely. He spent the next hour preparing the message carefully. The message he created included detailed tactical data from the battle, sensor logs showing the detonations and their effects, casualty estimates for the Zakran fleet, video footage of the debris field where the 9th Fleet had died. Everything was documented and verified. Then Sullivan recorded a video message to accompany the data. He stood in front of a camera on the bridge of the Vengeance. Behind him, visible through the viewport, was the massive field of wreckage that had once been 300 proud warships. He was still wearing his uniform, which was scorched and stained from the battle. He looked directly into the camera and began speaking. He identified himself as Captain Roy Sullivan of the United Nations Space Force. He stated that the Zakran 9th Fleet had entered human space with an ultimatum demanding surrender. They had demanded Earth's freedom, 30% of the human population as slaves, and all of humanity's technology. Humanity had rejected those demands. He gestured to the viewport behind him, showing the debris field. This was what remained of their fleet. This was the price of threatening humanity. Sullivan continued speaking, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. He explained that the Zakran Empire had probably grown accustomed to easy victories. They had conquered 47 species who valued survival over dignity. They had probably stopped expecting real resistance long ago. But humanity was different. Humans had evolved on what they called a death world. Everything on Earth, from the predators to the weather to the diseases, had tried to kill humanity for 200,000 years. Humanity had survived by being more stubborn, more vicious, and more willing to die fighting than any other species. That fundamental nature had not changed just because humans had learned to build spaceships. He leaned forward slightly toward the camera. The Zakran had given humanity an ultimatum. Now humanity had an ultimatum for them. Leave human space alone. Never return to this region of the galaxy. Stay away from Earth and all human colonies. Because if the Zakran Empire ever returned, humanity would not wait for them to reach Earth. Humans would bring fire to the Zakran homeworld and every colony they possessed. And humanity was very good at building ships, very good at finding new and terrible ways to wage war. The Zakran had just learned that lesson at the cost of 300 ships and hundreds of thousands of lives. The choice of whether they needed to learn it again was entirely up to them. The message ended. Sullivan ordered it transmitted immediately toward Zakran space. At faster than light speeds, the message would take several months to reach the Zakran homeworld. But it would get there eventually. And when it did, the Zakran leadership would have to decide how to respond. Sullivan hoped they would be smart enough to accept the warning. He hoped they would leave humanity alone. But if they did not, if they came back with a bigger fleet seeking revenge, then humanity would be ready. The tactic they had used today could be refined, improved, and scaled up. Earth's shipyards were already beginning construction on new vessels designed specifically for this kind of warfare. Humanity had discovered something important about themselves. They were very good at this. President Claire Morrison stood at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, looking out over rows upon rows of fresh graves. The cemetery had needed to expand to accommodate 17,000 new burials. These were the crew members of the 43 ships that had deliberately destroyed themselves to save humanity. The graves stretched as far as she could see, each one marked with a simple white marker bearing a name, rank, and the date they had died. The funeral services had taken days to complete. Morrison had attended as many as she physically could, but there were simply too many for her to be present at all of them. She had met with families, held the hands of widows and widowers, hugged crying children who would grow up without their parents. The weight of those 17,000 deaths sat heavily on her shoulders. General Kate Foster stood beside the president, also looking out over the cemetery. Foster had been the one to approve the tactical plan that Colonel Martinez had proposed. She had known it would result in massive casualties, but she had also known it was the only way humanity could survive. That knowledge did not make the guilt any easier to bear. She spoke quietly, mentioning that historians were already calling it the detonation. That was the name that was being used to describe the battle and the tactic that had won it. The detonation at Sol. It would be remembered forever as the moment humanity proved they would rather die than submit. Morrison nodded slowly and responded that they had lost 17,000 brave souls. But in exchange they had saved 10 billion people from slavery. They had preserved humanity's freedom and independence. They had sent a message to the entire galaxy that Earth was not an easy target. The math was brutal, but it was undeniable. 17,000 deaths in exchange for the survival of the species. Future generations would judge whether that trade had been worth it. Morrison believed it had been, but she knew that belief would haunt her for the rest of her life. Foster mentioned that the engineering teams had already begun analyzing the battle data. They were refining the tactic, making it more efficient, and designing new ship classes specifically built around the concept. If humanity ever faced another threat like the Zakran, they would be even more prepared. The new ships would be able to achieve critical reactor states faster, maintain them longer, and deliver even more devastating detonations. Earth's shipyards were working around the clock to build these new vessels. Within a year, humanity would have a fleet twice the size of what they had possessed before the Zakran arrived. Within 5 years, they would have the most feared military force in this entire region of space. Morrison watched as honor guards moved through the cemetery, placing flags on the graves of the Defiance crew. Admiral Hunt had been aboard that ship when it detonated. He had known exactly what he was doing and what it would cost. He had given the order anyway because someone had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. Morrison had signed the order authorizing the plan, but Hunt had been the one to execute it. His sacrifice and the sacrifice of everyone who had died with him had saved humanity. She would make sure their names were never forgotten. Across human space, the mood was complex and conflicted. There was celebration that Earth had survived. There was pride that humanity had defeated a superior force. But there was also grief for the tremendous losses and fear about what might come next. The Zakran Empire was vast and powerful. The Ninth Fleet had been just one part of their military. What would happen when the rest of the Empire learned what had occurred at Sol? Would they leave humanity alone, or would they return seeking revenge with even greater numbers? The message that Captain Sullivan had sent was traveling through space at faster-than-light speeds. It would take months to reach the Zakran homeworld, but eventually it would arrive. The Zakran leadership would watch the video, review the tactical data, and see the complete destruction of their most elite fleet. Then they would have to make a decision about how to respond. Humanity waited nervously for that response, hoping that the Zakran would be wise enough to accept the warning and stay away. 6 months after the battle, the Zakran response arrived. It was not a military fleet. It was a single message transmitted from the Zakran homeworld directly to Earth. The message was brief and formal. The Zakran Empire acknowledged the destruction of the Ninth Fleet. They stated that Sol System and all surrounding space was now designated as a restricted zone. Zakran vessels were forbidden from entering human territory. The Empire had no further interest in conflict with humanity. The message ended with a simple statement that made Morrison smile. They called humanity an unpredictable and dangerous species that employed irrational tactics. The cost of conquest was deemed prohibitive. In other words, the Zakran had decided that Earth was more trouble than it was worth. Morrison released the message to the public, and the reaction was immediate celebration. Humanity had not just survived, they had won their independence. The Zakran Empire, which had conquered 47 species, had officially declared that they would leave Earth alone. It was a victory more complete than anyone had dared to hope for. But Morrison knew this was not the end of humanity's struggles. It was just the beginning. Earth had announced its presence to the galaxy in the most dramatic way possible. Other species would hear about what happened at Sol. Some would respect humanity's strength, while others might see them as a threat that needed to be eliminated before they became too powerful. Morrison addressed the United Nations and spoke about the future. Humanity could not afford to become complacent. They had won one battle, but there would be others. The galaxy was vast and filled with unknown dangers. Earth needed to continue building ships, developing new technologies, and preparing for whatever came next. But they also needed to remember the price that had been paid for their freedom. 17,000 people had given their lives so that billions could remain free. That sacrifice demanded that humanity use their freedom wisely. In orbit above Earth, construction continued on the new fleet. Engineers worked alongside artificial intelligence systems to design ships that were faster, stronger, and more deadly than anything that had come before. The new vessels incorporated lessons learned from the battle with the Zakran. They had improved reactor designs, better weapon systems, and enhanced armor. But more importantly, they had a new feature built into every single ship, a manual override that would allow the crew to deliberately cause a reactor detonation if necessary. It was a feature that everyone hoped would never be used again, but that would remain available if humanity ever found itself facing impossible odds. The tactic had been given an official name in military documentation. They called it the final option. It was reserved for situations where conventional tactics had failed and where the survival of humanity itself was at stake. Training protocols were developed to teach crews how to execute the final option if it was ever ordered. Psychological counseling was provided to help crew members cope with the knowledge that their ships could become weapons of last resort. It was a grim addition to military doctrine, but it was necessary. Humanity had learned that sometimes survival required terrible choices. Captain Sullivan was promoted to admiral and given command of the new Earth Defense Fleet. He spent his days overseeing training exercises, reviewing tactical plans, and preparing for threats that might never come. But he also spent time visiting the graves at Arlington. He felt responsible for the people who had died under his command during the battle. He made sure that every crew member who served under him knew the story of the detonation. He wanted them to understand that the final option was not just a tactic. It was a promise that humanity would never surrender, never submit, and never allow themselves to be enslaved no matter what the cost. Years passed and the galaxy began to change. Other species heard about what happened at Sol. Some kept their distance, wary of the species that had destroyed an entire fleet through suicidal tactics. Others reached out to humanity with offers of trade and alliance, seeing Earth as a potential partner rather than a target. Humanity slowly began to establish itself as a legitimate power in galactic politics. They were no longer the primitive species that others could threaten with impunity. They were the species that had answered an ultimatum with fire and had reduced the mighty Ninth Fleet to ashes. That reputation preceded them wherever they went, and it served them well.